Today I'm making kombucha, and the first step is I like to make an iced tea concentrate because that's easier than heating up just a whole gallon of water when you're making a lot of kombucha. So I've heated up 6 cups of water here, and you want 8 tea bags per gallon that you're making, and I'm actually making 1.5 gallons today, so I have 12 tea bags. Before I do that, I should put the sugar in. We're going to start with the sugar. I'm using evaporated cane juice. Kombucha is a little funny in the health food world because it actually prefers white sugar, just straight sugar to feed on, which is okay because it pretty much all gets used up by the kombucha, depending on how sweet you leave it and how long you let it ferment. And I'm putting in 1.5 cups of sugar for 1.5 gallons, so that's about 1 cup per gallon that you want to make. I am using evaporated cane juice instead of straight white sugar. That way you don't have to worry about GMO in the sugar beets or anything like that. And it does have a little bit of molasses in it, but it seems to work just fine for the SCOBY. And then I will add the tea. And similar to the sugar, the SCOBY actually needs some caffeine to survive. And they say that a lot of the caffeine gets eaten by the SCOBY. Again, that depends on how long you let it ferment, so how long it gets to eat on the sugar and the caffeine that's in the tea mixture. I like to have as little caffeine in the mixture as possible because I'm very sensitive to caffeine, and I find that at the sweetness that we like it, which is not very long fermented, there's still enough caffeine left in it to affect me. So today what I'm using is half green tea and half decaffeinated black tea. Sometimes if I'm using regular black tea, I'll dunk it in boiling water for about 30 seconds first, and that removes a lot of the caffeine without having to worry about what chemicals or whatever they used in their decaffeination process when you bought it. And you can also use herbal teas, but the SCOBY really thrives on black tea for some reason. That's just seems to be what it was designed to work well with. So you really have to feed it some black tea and some caffeine. You can either do a batch of all herbal tea and then do a batch of all black tea the next time, or you can do batches that are half black tea and half herbal tea. You want to be very careful about any herbal teas that contain oils. Chai often contains oils, peppermint contains oils, and those will tend to kind of suffocate the SCOBY. And I have done peppermint kombucha, half peppermint, half black tea, and it's worked okay, and it did not kill my SCOBY, but I could definitely tell that the SCOBY was not thriving as much as when I use black tea or green tea. So it's really much safer if you want a peppermint flavored tea to add some peppermint flavoring in the second ferment, and I'll get to that later in the video and show you about the second ferment and what that means. And now that that's steeping with 8 tea bags for every gallon and 1 cup of sugar for every gallon, I'm going to go ahead and bottle the previous batch of kombucha that I had going. Here's where I ferment my kombucha. You can see there's a SCOBY in each of these containers. This is a gallon jar, and it has a metal lid. Metal does not instantly kill SCOBYs, but it kind of weakens them over time. So I like to keep the liquid level down a little bit in this jar so the SCOBY doesn't bump up against the metal lid. I tried using a cheesecloth between there, and the SCOBY actually grew into the cheesecloth, and it was had to throw away that layer of SCOBY. And then this is a half gallon, has a nice plastic sealing lid. I really like this picture. I need to get more because now I'm using this one just for fermenting kombucha. And actually the first thing I'm going to do is pour off the 3 cups of this batch of kombucha that I need to save for the next batch. That's 2 cups for every gallon of kombucha that you're making. Whack! Try not to splash it all over the countertop. And the reason for that is because the kombucha that you've already made is acidic, and so it keeps bad bacteria from growing while your new batch is working on fermenting. And then I'm going to go ahead and take the SCOBYs out. And these are both very nicely growing SCOBYs. They kind of look like dead jellyfish. This one is actually, it's getting older and getting whiter. When I first got it, it was more translucent like this. And this is getting nice and thick, And scobies usually have layers you can peel apart here. That top layer is kind of thick in that case. Oh, there you go. You can see how you can just peel it apart nicely there. And in this case, I am going to peel off the very bottom layer and save it, possibly give it away to someone else if anyone wants it, or I may end up throwing it away, because the bottom layer is the oldest layer, and the SCOBY does kind of get worn out over time. And if you have too much SCOBY in your jar, then it'll ferment too quickly and your kombucha will go sour very fast. So I'm going to just drop the SCOBYs in there for safekeeping. You really want to keep your SCOBYs away from prolonged contact with anything metal, as I said, and chlorine and grease and things like that. So I like to just drop it in here for safekeeping while I'm working. Here's the other SCOBY. It's not quite as thick as the other one, but it's still coming along nicely. Has some discoloration from the tea, has some little white bumps. It's almost like a cow's tongue or something, but there's no signs of mold, so it's still perfectly healthy, despite the fact that it looks weird, as a SCOBY should. So I'm going to go ahead and peel the very bottom layer off that one too. And if your SCOBY has rips or holes in it, that's perfectly fine. It doesn't really affect how it works. If you happen to have recently been given a SCOBY by a friend, and they happen to have given you a young SCOBY, it may look something more like this. More translucent, more like jelly almost. And this is a particularly small one. These will form in your kombucha as it sits in your fridge, or sometimes just as it sits out for a couple of days carbonating. And they work just as well as the older SCOBYs, but they do take a little longer to work. So if you have a young SCOBY, you probably want to give it a little extra time to do its job. There's some yeast sediment there. I'm just going to fish that out. I don't think I need that in my kombucha. Alright, so I'm going to pour this kombucha into other containers for the secondary ferment, which is where it carbonates. And the secondary ferment is not really necessary, but it does make for a nice fizzy kombucha, which most people prefer. I'm using a gallon plastic jug for the secondary ferment for this one. Plastic is much easier when you're just starting kombucha, as you're kind of getting a feel for how quickly it carbonates, because you can just feel the bottle. And if it's hard, then it's carbonated. And if it's still kind of squishy, then it's not fully carbonated yet. Some people move on to quart jars once they've kind of gotten the feel for their kombucha and how quickly it carbonates. I tend to prefer mine carbonated for about a day. It's not super fizzy at that point, but it is mostly fizzy. So I'm just going to go ahead and lid this. I left the lid somewhere. I found the lid. And then lid this tightly so that it can carbonate. This kombucha is fermented long enough that it's actually just starting to be fizzy already. And at this point, in the secondary ferment, you can add flavoring if you like. You can have a little cloth bag with some herbs like some peppermint or something like that tied up in it. You can add some ginger, just roughly chopped. You can add fruits or fruit juice, just about anything you want at this point to flavor your kombucha. And then I just lid it tightly, and I usually set mine on top of the fridge. That's my easy place for fermenting things. But any place you want where it can just kind of sit undisturbed for a day and finish carbonating. And then at this point, I'm going to go ahead and put the SCOBYs back in the jar and add the finished kombucha. And then they will be ready to add the iced tea concentrate and water to fill the jars. I'm putting 2 cups of the finished kombucha in the gallon jar and 1 cup in the half-gallon jar. Now that the iced tea concentrate is finished cooling and it's made a nice strong brew, strong tea is important when making kombucha because the SCOBY actually feeds off nutrients from the tea, so you want it to be nice and strong and lots of nutrients for the SCOBY to feed on. Discard the tea bags, and I'm going to put this into my measuring cup so it's a little easier to divide up. And I'm splashing tea everywhere again. Alright, so I'm going to put 4 cups in the gallon jar and 2 cups in the half gallon. And this is just only important as a ratio of how much iced tea concentrate I made. You can really make it with as little or as much water as you want at this point. The important thing is how much sugar, how many tea bags, and how much water is in the finished product. And then I'll add water. I'm having trouble with my Berkey filtering fast enough right now. I need to clean the filters. So I'm just going to fill the half-gallon jar now, and I'll fill the gallon jar later off video. The SCOBie, as you can see, is kind of floating sideways right now from the pressure of putting the water in. And that's fine. It doesn't really matter where the SCOBie floats. It'll usually end up floating near the top eventually, but it's not really important. And then I'm just going to very loosely fasten this. You don't want it to be tight at this point because you want room for the carbonation gases to escape if they do form at this stage. And then you just set this someplace where it can ferment, someplace out of the way where you don't have to disturb it too much. And usually you'll hear to ferment it for 10 to 14 days. But we prefer it sweeter, so I normally ferment it for more like 3 to 4 days for us. If you do use peppermint tea or something like that, you can go longer and it'll still be sweet because it just does not ferment nearly as fast with the peppermint oils in there. So if this is your first time making kombucha, you may actually want to taste it every day to find out when it's just at the point where you like it. Though I do find that the secondary ferment to carbonate it also mellows the flavor a little bit, so if you're afraid that you let it go too long and it's too tart, it may be just fine after you ferment it again. So that is kombucha.